Welcome to Sculpture Vulture. I'm Lucy Branch, a sculptural conservator and author who is endlessly fascinated by public sculpture. I bring you a series of interviews with sculptors and other fascinating people involved in the field that inspires me, and I hope will do the same for you. You can see the photographs that accompany the episode and the show notes at sculpturevulture.co.uk. Hello, Sculpture Vultures. Hope all is well with you and that you've had a good week. It's nearly the summer holidays. Anyone with children is starting to get slightly nervous because they know they've got to juggle work and kids, and that is always an extra challenge at this time of year. But a little bit of sun would help the situation. We've had a lot of rain in London, which is not helping the kind of work that we do, as the majority of our work is outdoors. But this week, actually, I have been very lucky because I've been beavering away inside the studio, which is a rare thing. It is my husband's studio because he works on small objects, whereas I specialise in large objects that can't be moved usually. And he's been away, so I've taken over his studio. I'm sure he'll be returning with a frown when he realizes the invasion that's taken place. But I have been beavering away on the most fantastic little objects. They are Napoleonic eagles, and these are really fantastic bronze objects that are gilded, and they are owned by the Chelsea Hospital in London. They were presented to Napoleon's regiments by the man himself and carried on these long poles into battle. And the British during the battles have actually captured several of these. I think it's like the equivalent of our colours. You know, the colours are captured if you're defeated in battle and taken by the other side. So what I've been doing is just giving these a little bit of TLC, some cleaning and care, and taking away some areas of disfiguration that have happened over time. These are not battle wounds. We don't remove that kind of history, even if it is disfiguring on objects these days, because it's part of the history of the object. But we do soften the scars of time so that marks which have come about just because of breakdowns in old coatings or environmental issues don't become distracting, and so that the objects can carry on being enjoyed in the way that they were intended to. Obviously, these were never intended to be artworks. But they are artworks, and they've got such character, sort of like battle scarred, but really beautiful things, and so proud and kind of, I just think they're full of character. They will be back on display at the Chelsea Hospital soon, and definitely worth a visit if you're going over there. I mean, the Chelsea Hospital's gorgeous and worth a visit anyway. Got tons of really interesting features in the building, but I definitely recommend Napoleon's Eagles. So today I have Richard Calvocoressi, CBE, talking to me, and I'm going to try not to be a bit of a fangirl because he is such a brilliant man. He is a scholar and art historian. He has served as a curator at the Tate, London, and then became director of the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art in Edinburgh, and then the director of the Henry Moore Foundation. He then went on to the Gagosian in 2015 and has curated for them ever since, as well as writing catalogues and interviewing artists. And we came across each other through work. I was involved in the Holborn Museum's exhibition of Rodins and Degas a couple of years ago, and we were connected at that point, and I've been dying to interview him ever since, but as you know, I couldn't do it over the last couple of years. Life has been too manic, but I have, ensured that I have pursued him to do this interview, because how can you not want to talk to someone who has done so many brilliant things? I could have actually talked to him about any number of sculptors, because his experience is, well, it's as broad as it is deep. But I wanted to focus on Henry Moore today, who is an endlessly fascinating character to me, and I'm sure to anyone who is interested in sculpture. And so I began our conversation today by asking about the purpose of the Henry Moore Foundation.
Yes, well, it has three or four objectives, really. The first is to look after, um, conserve, display a very large collection of Henry Moore's own work that he gifted to the foundation at his home in Hertfordshire, at Perry Green, near Much Haddam in Hertfordshire, where his studios, his own house, and the grounds where he ideally sited his sculpture, the gardens and parkland, are open to the public. So that's really the first thing, is to preserve that, his legacy. At the same time, with this very large collection of his sculpture, but not only his sculpture, his prints and drawings too, um, the foundation helps with Henry Moore exhibitions all over the world. So whenever, a reputable museum wants to put on a Henry Moore exhibition, they will probably approach the foundation for loans. And in a very few cases, the foundation might even give financial support. Like, for example, when I was director of the foundation in 2010, the Tate Britain did a big Henry Moore exhibition, and we helped not only with loans but also with funding for that because we felt it was so important and very high profile. And afterwards, it travelled to Toronto to the Art Gallery of Ontario, which is incidentally a museum where he made a very big donation before setting up the foundation. He made two big donations, one to the Tate of about 35 bronzes, I think, from different points in his career, and secondly to the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, which is a big collection of his plasters. And he went out there and advised on the display and the lighting and so on. So that's really the first job or task of the foundation, um, really to keep more, in the public eye, both at home and abroad. Um, Secondly, to run the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds, in West Yorkshire, where he studied at Art College before going to the Royal College of Art. And that the institute was founded, in fact, after his death, but there was a sort of prototype for it at Leeds City Art Gallery. It's right next to the Art Gallery. In fact, there's a bridge connecting the two. So it's called the Henry Moore Institute for the Study of Sculpture, and that's really like an academic research institute. So through lectures, conferences, publications, residencies, a very good archive and library, but also an exhibition space. They look at sculpture, in its broadest terms. So it's not really about Henry Moore, it's about sculpture. Although there's nothing to stop the Institute from time to time putting on a Henry Moore exhibition or, showing Henry Moore in dialogue with other artists or whatever.
That's actually very Henry Moore, isn't it? He loved to talk about sculpture, but he didn't necessarily eulogize about what his own sculpture meant. He was much
No,
more about a bigger dialogue about sculpture than
absolutely.
just he liked people
Yeah,
to make up their own minds about things.
very much so. And in fact,
Yeah.
in many ways, he was the first sort of media sculptor, TV sculptor. But I mean, I don't mean, that's not meant to sound in any way critical, but he used photography and then the moving image to promote his own work, but also to talk more generally about sculpture. And there's some amazing documentary films made by the BBC in the um, probably late 50s, early 60s, I think. Hugh Weldon and others, and then John Reed, who was one of Herbert Reed's sons, made documentaries, a number of documentaries on Henry Moore, in which he would, I think in the Hugh Weldon series, it was called Monitor. I think there's one quite famous one where he picks up objects from his own collection, like pre-Columbian pieces, Cycladic figures, as well as the kind of bones and stones that he picked up in the fields around his home at Perry Green and used as the basis for so many sculptures. So that's so it's the legacy, his legacy in his own collection is wide and widely disseminating it around the world. Secondly, the Institute. And then the third objective is grants. It's a big grant-giving charity. Probably, I mean, certainly for a long time, it was the only artist endowed foundation in the UK that gave grants regularly. I suppose it started, I mean, he set up the foundation in 1977 and he died in 1986. And that's when all his investments and property went into the foundation. To begin with, it was just the artworks. Then, so from his death, the investments would have built up, the capital would have built up, and they started giving grants, I think, in the early 90s. But by the time I took over in 2007, we were giving away about 1.5 million pounds a year in grants, 1.5 million. And that was to sculptural projects of all kinds. I mean, exhibitions, collections, acquisitions, conservation, very important, publications, university posts, or certainly postdoctoral PhDs and so on. So, a wide range of recipients, never to individual artists, sculptors, because I think the view was taken that if we advertise that, we could just get flooded with applications. So the grants were always channeled through existing charitable institutions, be it art galleries, museums, art galleries, publishers, art colleges, universities, and so on.
I was thinking about the exhibitions because there have been so many exhibitions, and it was obviously quite something he really believed in about getting his art out there and also understanding out there. It's a dizzying number, and I was amazed how he could still be creating quantity of sculpture that he was producing. I know he had assistants, but it was vast, and yet still handle the all of these exhibitions. Because I think there were quite many even before the foundation was put together. So there must have been a stage where they were handling that in-house as well. I mean, how did he do that?
I mean, I think a lot of the exhibitions abroad would have been organized by the British Council. The British Council played a
Right.
big role in really promoting his work abroad, if you like, particularly obviously after the war, because the British Council wasn't really founded until the late 40s, I think. And so a lot of these, for example, he would maybe had a big show at the Tate, let's say. He had a big show at the Tate in 1951, his first big retrospective. I can't remember off the top of my head whether that was then toured abroad, but it would have been under the auspices of the British Council. So he worked very closely with officers of the British Council in London at the headquarters and then in the individual countries. So a lot of those shows would have been British Council organized shows, and he was seen. I mean, there's a political aspect to this because after the war, he was, and after the destruction and the devastation and the displacement and the suffering, and Europe, being at war internally with itself, European nations, he was seen as a kind of healing figure. These figurative pieces, the mother and child, the family group, and so on, were seen as sort of somehow um, um, recalling or getting back to humanist values that had somehow been been lost during that, the catastrophe, the conflict where, so many millions died. So Moore was very much, particularly about it, among the Western European nations, but also even behind the Iron Curtain, I think, whenever it was possible, was a kind of seen as a kind of unifying force in society again. So the British Council very much adopted him as their kind of their main figurehead.
I mean, do you think that was he the in the right place at the right time, which contributed to that success? Or was it that actually he was offering something that was really needed? There was a desire for it in the not only in the British Council needing to maybe use the art, but also in people. I'm not sure which one it was, and the more I read about him, the more I can't decide.
I think there's probably a bit of both. I think certainly the latter. I mean, don't forget, he had fought in the First World War. He'd been in the trenches. He'd seen,
Yeah.
humanity at its worst and at its best at the same time. Um, he um, he'd experienced the Blitz in London, where, of course, he drew Londoners sheltering in the London Underground from the bombing. Later in the 50s, he was chairman, yes, he was chair of the jury to select an artist. It was an international competition to select an artist to create a memorial at Auschwitz. And he went to Auschwitz. He spent a week, nearly a week at the camp. I mean, not staying overnight at the camp, staying nearby in a hotel with the other members of the jury. So, he was very much um, aware of the appalling atrocities and suffering that had taken place throughout Europe. And I think, and that certainly had an impact on his work. If you think about, there's broken forms, there's punctured bodies, there's that period of extremely emaciated figures. Um, uh, yeah, the fragmented, that was definitely, I think, came partly out of the trenches and partly out of World War II, what he'd seen during the war. And then, obviously after the war, um, there was a lot of documentary photographs and films of the concentration camps, the death camps. So, as with Sutherland, as with Francis Bacon, it had an impact on their work. So I think he wasn't a believer in the sense of being a Christian or a devout Christian or religious, but I think there was definitely a religious um, depth there, aspect to his work. I mean, he did do a Madonna and Child for St. Matthew's Church in Northampton at the end of the war when Graham Sutherland did a painting of a crucifixion, and he found it difficult, but nevertheless, he realized that in a way, Christian iconography could, just as Francis Bacon did with his triptychs, his crucifixion triptych, Christian iconography was able to say something sort of universal about, you know, human cruelty
Yeah,
and
yeah.
suffering.
So when you came to the foundation, did you know what you wanted to achieve? Or was it something that is that something you have to go into somewhere like that and find your own way, listen to all the voices, particularly Henry Moore's, I imagine, in the background,
Yes, well,
directing you?
there was some very practical problems that I discovered on arrival, like simple things like storage. The storage for the sculpture collection was woefully inadequate. It was being stored in um, you know converted barns, old Hertfordshire barns. There'd been a big theft of a piece a few years before I took over. So that my first priority was really to do a master plan for the whole site, and we did that, and the first building we constructed according to that plan was a brand new sculpture store, state-of-the-art sculpture store in terms of security and climate control and all the rest of it. And then the next phase was trying to get all the public um, public facing facilities at Perry Green onto one side of the main road. So the sculpture store was on the other side of the main road, and that was fine because you didn't really want the public going into or near the store. And then all the other things like cafe and shop and car park, we got over onto the side where the houses and the grounds and the studios, but very discreetly hidden in the trees. So we opened right towards the end of my time, he opened a new kind of visitor center there with a shop and a cafe and access right onto the grounds, straight onto the grounds to enjoy the sculpture in the kind of natural setting that he favored. And also, if you wanted to go around his house, you could book a tour. Um, and then and then the last bit of that sort of more practical innovations was to build a proper archive and library, because the wonderful archive that they have at Perry Green, he never threw anything away. It's a bit like Benjamin Britten's archive in Aldeburgh. He was one of those people who kept everything, press cuttings and letters and etc. etc. Plus, very good library and that. So we built a new archive and library, and I was there only 2 or 3 weeks ago and was very pleased to see it being well used. And again, it's quite discreetly tucked away. The original archive and library was in a converted residential house in the village, which was, really, I mean, the conditions there were absolutely not right for paper or photograph, negatives or photographs and that kind of. So all that was done, and then the more kind of creative ambition was I felt the foundation wasn't international enough. Its grants could have gone to projects abroad more. I mean, they were doing a certain amount abroad, but not enough, I felt. So that we changed that, and we supported a number of different types of projects, the sort of things I've already outlined, what the grants went on abroad, internationally, both in Europe and, in the Americas, United States and so on. And also, I felt it was very important that we should be supporting, really major exhibitions of Henry Moore's work around the world, and not really, fritter our time and resources and money away on minor shows, but really concentrate on the big ones. And then I suppose the last thing I felt was very important to do if we could, and that was really, I only learnt that by being there, was to encourage owners of his work around the world in public sites to look after his work, because I'm sure you all know that as soon as a bronze goes outdoors, particularly in an urban environment, it's subject to all sorts of invasions of, atmosphere and pollution and et cetera, the elements. And if it's not, regularly cleaned and waxed, it disintegrates, or it deteriorates. And we found a number of pieces like that in different cities. I mean, the two big Henry Moores in London that we helped conserve were the arch in Kensington Gardens, which was made of stone, and which this was an interesting case because Moore had a big show at the Serpentine Gallery in the late 70s, just I think at the time he set up the foundation. It was the last show he was involved in before the foundation. And I think the Serpentine showed the essentially the gift that was going to the Tate, the 35 bronzes, but also he erected in across the water from, I don't think it's Long Water, I think it's called, but you could see it from the Serpentine Gallery. Um, this very large arch um, made in travertine, I think it is, and over the years, it's made it's comes apart. It's in 6 or 7 pieces, obviously, because it's you couldn't carve
Gosh.
anything on that scale that would stand up or last very long. Um, and it had been kind of fixed internally by rods. The parts. Now the what had happened over the years was that the frost and rainwater had taken their toll, and the rods internally were rusting. So the whole thing was unstable. The Royal Parks, who owned it, or certainly who looked after it, or they may not have existed in that form when he gave it to the Serpentine Park, or whatever it was called, but they accepted responsibility for it. And it had been in storage. Basically, it had been disassembled and was in storage for years. And we, thanks to new kind of laser technology and all sorts of new um, uh, methods that weren't available in the 70s, managed to um, have it pinned together internally by a completely different um, type of rod that was rust proof. And there was a lot of laser scanning that went on. And I think we paid for quite a lot of that before it was re-erected in, I can't remember when it was, let's say 2010 or something like that. And then the other piece in London, which was a bronze, was just opposite the Houses of Parliament on College Green, more or less opposite where the Rodins are, the Burghers of Calais, the Rodin in Victoria Gardens. Um, Knife edge two-piece, which was a very, very highly visible sculpture by Moore, because it whenever an MP was interviewed outside on College Green by the BBC or whoever it was, um, that you'd see it in the background. It was always the backdrop to numerous interviews with politicians. So
And I could never listen to what the politicians were saying because I was always so distracted by the condition of the statue.
yes, it
It
was in a
used to
terrible
it used
state.
to mean that I couldn't hear what they were saying because I was so sort of
Yeah,
drawn in of like state of it, it's at the time. But
it
it was
was
good
no,
that it
it
did
was
get
really
some
shocking, and
conservation.
it was not only scratched and the patina had eroded and the plinth was completely broken too. But the interesting thing there, and this is a general problem, we couldn't find the owner. It had been
Yes, it
given,
happens so much.
yeah, I mean the owner, it had been given by Moore to the City of London through Jenny Lee, who was Minister for the Arts in the late 1960s, I think. And the City of London, I mean, it wasn't in the City of London, it was in Westminster. So it was a sort of, it was kind of, no one would claim responsibility for it. We tried everybody. Was it, I think it had, I think it had a show at the ICA and it had been done after. Anyway, we, we tried everybody, Royal Parks, Westminster, Houses of
No,
Parliament.
they all knew they
No
knew they would
one
have to pay.
no one would take responsibility. And finally, the Houses of Parliament collection said, "Okay, we'll take it on." And so we'll take, because obviously they have a big collection inside the House of Commons and the House of Lords, but not so much outside. And in fact, I don't know if they have. Well, they have. There are 1 or 2 statues around. Obviously, there are some pieces outside the building. So they took it on. We had to draw up a deed of gift with lawyers, and they agreed to look after it, maintain it regularly, and we paid for I think the foundation. I'm saying we. I'm no longer. I've been at the foundation for 8 years, but the foundation paid, I think, for all or certainly most of the maybe half or I can't remember the percentage of the repair work, both to the sculpture itself, the repatination, and to the plinth. And I think a friend of mine was walked past it the other day and said it was still, this is, 10 or 15 years later, is perhaps, anyway, certainly 10 years later, it's still looking pretty good. There are examples of are helping with works in public sites in Florence and also in Berlin, I think. So I felt that was, it's such an important thing that if a sculptor's,
Very.
if works are cited in public place, in a prominent public site, um, they have to be looking their best, and it's very often down to the artist or the foundation or the artist's estate to make sure that happens, because suddenly you find that no one is prepared to do it, and it hasn't been done for years.
I mean, that's a lot of different aspects that you're looking after. Obviously, your position, your role, director, you are supposed to be responsible for many things and have that big view of the whole collection. But I wondered if it's you're keeping uh, the artist's sort of views in your head when you're making those decisions, or whether it's more like kind of power of attorney where you're sort of making the right decisions for the collection and for the foundation rather than necessarily what Moore would have wanted himself.
It's a very good question, that, because I mean, I don't know if you know that he stipulated in his will that there should be no posthumous casts of his work, no further casts. I mean, with one exception, if there was an edition that hadn't yet been completed, let's say 5 out of 6 had been cast and there was still one left, or 7 out of 9 or something like that, he said that the edition could be completed under the supervision of uh, his bronze foundry in Berlin, Noack, whom he used for
Okay.
really the last, particularly for the largest work, very large pieces, probably used for the last, 20, 30 years of his career, under the supervision of Hermann Noack, the owner whom he trusted, and Bernard Meadows, who was his assistant at the time. So there were a few pieces that were cast after his death under their supervision, because they knew exactly how he wanted them finished, patinated, polished, etc. But after that, nothing. So there were no further casts of anything effectively after 1986, with 1 or 2 exceptions, as I just outlined. And of course, this is in complete contrast to an artist like Rodin, where I mean, the way that the only way the Rodin Museum in Paris can keep going is through selling casts, posthumous casts of his work. And of course, they have numerous plasters in store, which they can use. They can turn into bronzes through, molds and into bronzes. And there is a limit under French law about how many you can do. I think it's 12 or something. But that's the way the road, and Rodin was, perfectly happy about that, because I don't think he was so involved as Moore was in the patination of his own work. He employed patineur, I think they're called in French. So it made the job easier in a sense. There were duplicates, of course. We had the foundation might have had duplicate casts of his work, and the duplicate would, whenever there was a big capital project like the ones I've outlined at Perry Green, the store, for example, or the new archive and library, the foundation would sell a cast to pay for that, rather than breaking into the endowment, which was much more for the running costs. So we sort of knew what, in terms of, well, I mean, yes. So, okay, so a sculpture by Moore has disintegrated or deteriorated to the extent that it needs repatinating. His assistants at Perry Green carried on working for the foundation after his death, and they would train up the subsequent generation. So there are people at the foundation. There are staff, technical staff, conservators, and so on, who would have absorbed all that knowledge and information from the early assistants who were employed by the foundation, carried on after Moore's death. So there was a sort of line of succession. There's a kind of, you know, knowledge there, sort of family, knowledge. So
Inherited
I think,
knowledge, yeah.
yeah, I think, there's a sort of tradition there and many of the wonderful staff at the foundation had, even now, there are still a few who had worked there for more. Um, so that's rather a wonderful thing.
I mean, this is quite a big question, but I'm just fascinated on how you go from being a professional sculptor to being the legend that is Henry Moore. Um, do you think it was the foundation that made the difference? Do you think that creation of that sort of overseeing body is something that has really taken him to a different level than most sculptors even dream of?
I'm sure that's part of it, but I mean, don't forget that during his lifetime, by the 1970s, when he was coming up for 80, he was highly successful. He was one of the highest taxpayers in Britain, which was one reason he was advised to set up a foundation, clearly, because otherwise on his death, the collection would probably, a lot of it would have to have been split up and sold to pay tax. So, I mean, he didn't, we're very used now to artists becoming millionaires or billionaires in their, sort of 30s, 40s, 50s or whatever. That wasn't the case with Moore. I mean, he didn't really start to become financially successful probably until his 60s, certainly after the Second World War. And yeah, don't forget, he lived through two world wars, which had a big, impact on all production and all sorts of things. He lived incredibly simply. If you've ever visited the house at Perry Green, I mean, it's like, it's it's so different from what we know about the way successful artists, most of them will very often live now. He lived a very frugal life, actually, and um, but I think he had a vision for his own work. It's absolutely true. He set up the foundation to look after his own things. And as I'm sure you know, he preferred to see his big pieces sited outdoors in landscape, in rural or semi-rural landscape settings, rather than in urban settings or indoors. I'm not sure he was right about that, because I think some of those really large lake pieces, bronzes that he made in the sort of 70s, 60s and 70s, we did an exhibition of them at Gagosian, can't remember when it was, 10 or 15 years ago, indoors in the Britannia Street Gallery, which is a very large sort of warehouse type space, sort of place you might find in New York. And they really looked extraordinary. I mean, they looked so much more contemporary. They had an industrial feel to them. I felt Moore was, I saw Moore as a contemporary artist with that exhibition, in a way that seeing them outdoors in parks and so on, you don't, because they tend to get, in these wide open spaces, they lose their sense of monumentality. They lose the sense of scale. And they tend to, you're distracted by the plants and the greenery and so on, trees. So so that was one thing. We started experimenting, showing his work in settings that he might not initially have preferred. I think the foundation, yes, I think the foundation's done a huge amount to keep him in the public eye, to keep him relevant. Obviously, the reputation fluctuates. It goes up and down according to all sorts of, things to do with taste and fashion. But I think it's the demand for exhibitions of his work around the world has again that's also sort of you know dipped from time to time, but it's it constantly kind of reappears. I think the foundation, um, in the sense that it is the largest and the earliest artist endowed foundation in the UK, probably of its kind, has been a model for others. I mean, I know a number of younger artists, sculptors in Britain who are following that and setting up some kind of foundation. Um, and
Wow.
it's also much admired abroad. I mean, one of the things I did when I was director in 2012, I think it was to go to a 2-day conference in New York specifically about artist endowed foundations. And they asked me if I would give the keynote speech because it was felt that the Henry Moore Foundation outside the United States was really the only foundation that was doing anything comparable to the foundations in artist foundations in America, like Warhol, Rauschenberg, de Kooning, Pollock, Krasner, etc., Motherwell, um, all of which, most of which did different things, but there were many points of contact and similarity with the Henry Moore Foundation. And I think that what impressed them most about the Moore Foundation was its educational remit, brief, its teaching arm, if you like, through the institute in Leeds and through the grants that we gave to educational, universities for postdoctoral um, theses and so on, to do with sculpture, not necessarily to do with Henry Moore.
Richard, I so appreciate you talking to us today. I feel like I've really shortchanged the listeners because we could have spoken about any number of different sculptors or different artists. But I really appreciate it. And I know that you're very much in demand, so I won't keep you any longer.
Well, the only thing I would end by saying is that I did meet Henry Moore, which is really, really nice thing, because when I joined the Tate in 1979, then my first job they gave me was to catalogue his gift of these 35 sculptures that I've mentioned. So once I'd done a lot of research on it, I went up to see him at Perry Green. This would have been in the winter 1979, I think, December 1979, and spent an hour or two with him just going through all the works that he'd given to the Tate, showing photographs, taking notes, and he couldn't have been more charming, more delightful. He
Oh,
seemed to have all the time in the world. So I've always felt I had a personal connection with him when I took over the directorship of the foundation.
I feel so lucky to have got Richard on the podcast. He's such a busy man and a very sought after expert in the field of modern sculpture. And apart from, a CV that reads like a wish list of all the great places would have loved to have worked, he's one of the humblest and nicest of men in person that I think I've ever come across. I'm going to try and keep this section brief because minds like Richard, which are much greater than my own, have said all there is to say about the genius of Henry Moore and his work. But the part I am always endlessly fascinated with is how sculptors make that leap from just starting to make something, getting that feeling that they want to create, to going above and beyond their wildest dreams. Perhaps in the case of Henry Moore, it's it's a perfect circle where his creativity drove the success, but then the success drove an even bigger creative dream. I mean, I could be wrong, but I doubt that even he could have dreamed as big as he's become. Moore definitely had one key aspect to his success, and that was his focus on getting his work seen. He ensured that his works were on display as often as possible, and this is also in the early years of his career. But obviously, as soon as the British Council got involved, they took it up to a whole other level. I find the stories of the success of sculptors one of the most uplifting tonics in life. When you think about how unlikely it actually is, I mean, firstly, a sculptor has to spin together ideas in their mind, which are then translated through their hands into three-dimensional form. You then have to get those objects made into a permanent form, which is super, super expensive. Then you have to get the art out into the world in multiple times, not just once. And this isn't just a light thing like a book that you can pick up and take. These are heavy, awkward, expensive objects, which, even though they seem structurally solid, they're actually incredibly delicate because the pattern on them can be affected so easily. And so, you have to wrap them and put them in boxes, and you have to be careful because there's too much humidity. Even in the box, it will be affected. But then remember that in the case of someone like Moore, you have to start educating the public about what your forms are about. I mean, this applies to lots of sculptors who do very original work, but Moore's work, for example, might have been understood or familiar to an educated view, but the majority of the public, many of them, these works would have felt completely alien to the kind of classical art that they might have seen before. So you don't only have to get them out there, you have to ensure that there is a kind of narrative that people begin to understand and become familiar with. And, these works don't just cost pennies to buy. They have an enormous amount of outlay. And so if you want to sell one of them, these works aren't just going to be sold to Joe Blogs. You've got to find a really tiny elite market to take them on and to actually pay your bills. I mean, the odds of making a living at this game are absolutely tiny. And yet, as you've seen time and time again on this show, it can be done. And perhaps in Moore's case, the jump from being professional to a legend, required the British Council to champion the work and a foundation to continue on the work after, he'd left the building. But if you'd ever doubted that something you want to do can't be done, just look at successful sculptors. They can show you that the world, it just doesn't make sense. If you added up all those different elements, you'd say, no way, never going to happen. And yet it does. It can. And that's exactly the kind of world that I want to live in. Coming up later in the season will be Ray Lonsdale of Two Rubber Red Things. He's a steel fabricator turned sculptor from the County Durham area, and his steel sculptures have become something of a feature of the North. His work has captured the hearts of so many people because they are truly authentic, heroic, so real. And Ray has a way of introducing them to us which really hits you hard. He's a sculptor that makes you just feel everything. So do join us later in the season to find out more about Ray. Please support the show. There's a few ways you can do this, particularly by rating and reviewing it on your podcast app. It only takes a few minutes and it really helps the show to get more exposure. It's tickling those algorithms. It has to be done as often as possible. But if that's too much tech for you, just tell a friend. I'm a big believer in word of mouth, and I hope that you like the content of the show. And if you know anyone else that's interested in sculpture, make sure they become a sculpture vulture. Finally, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com. /Lucy Branch. I really enjoy a coffee, and I often take a notebook and pen to my local coffee shop and dream up ideas for the show. So if you do that, you'll know that you'll be stoking the show's engine. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you've been inspired. You can look at the photographs and the accompanying blog post at sculpturevulture.co.uk. If you'd like to connect, you can find me on X at LucyBranch11 or Instagram LucyBranch_Antique Bronze. This podcast has been brought to you today by antiquebronze.co.uk.